In this section, I want to talk about environmental refugees. It is a subject of discussion in the halls of power in the United Nations, in Washington, D.C., in Canberra, and a lot of different parts of the world. How we can try to anticipate, prepare for, and to provide services for people who have to move because of environmental scarcity or abundance or natural disaster. And so I think for today, environmental refugees, I'll take a definition that Swain used. Those people have been forced to leave their traditional habitat, either temporarily or permanently, because of a marked environmental disruption, natural and or triggered by people, that jeopardized their existence and or seriously affected their quality of life. Like with the definition of refugees and IDPs, there is an element of either temporary or permanent because of a reason. Here, it's marked environmental disruption, which could either be natural, as we're going to see in the Natural Disasters Week in a few weeks, or motivated by people, which that would include scarcity or abundance. Scarcity would be drought, abundance would be flooding that affects their quality of life. And given that definition, it is still quite general, and it's one that's not been codified in anything approaching the 1951 Refugee Convention. And I still think we are a ways away for there to be any groundswell of multilateral efforts to try to come up with an international convention. We've seen, for those of you who are political science students or international relations students, quite dramatic growth in international conventions, treaties, agreements, and organizations to deal with new challenges. For me, I focus on human trafficking, and the Palermo Protocol in 2000 really shaped both the policymakers' understanding of what trafficking or modern slavery was, as well as creating a research agenda for people to try to understand the causes and effects of migration, using elements of control that take away the autonomy of people's decision making, and that it's going to take a while for there to be any kind of standard to address those kind of migrants. Right now, they're just lumped in with IDPs or refugees, and with the refugee definition including a well-found fear of prosecution. This definition here doesn't really include any political factors or persecution or violence, which would make it harder to try to bring environmental refugees into the conventions like that signed in 51, in which it was dealing mostly with political persecution and violence. So what are people to do, right? Without an international convention, without set international legal protections, the readings for this week, and which building on Hirschman, basically outlines three different alternatives for people who are faced with environmental disruption. You can do nothing and accept the costs. Hirschman would call that loyalty. Stay and mitigate changes, which Hirschman called voice, or leave, which is considered exit, right? And so we will look at in more detail in subsequent weeks how people make these decisions to do nothing and accept costs, stay, mitigate changes, and leave. And it made me think of I was raised before the internet, and so the only kind of interactivity or dynamic processes that I had in my life were in choose your own adventure books. I don't know how many of you actually have come across these. They're probably in your used bookstores or Vinnie's or Salvo's someplace. But this was one of those books that allowed you some kind of autonomy and decision-making capabilities. And this is a silly way of kind of talking about how people in life and death situations try to make decisions about how they deal with environmental challenges, the types of which we've talked about in this class. So first, you can do nothing and accept the costs. Your lives would be, as I showed you with the photos of New York with Hurricane Sandy. Sometimes people have tried to mitigate the changes, but a lot of people have just tried to accept the costs of the periodic disruption due to natural disasters. All the photos here are from Bangladesh, which has faced unprecedented climate disruption due to flooding over the last subsequent decades. The next option is to stay and mitigate changes. So the first, they had the high levels of water, but then their economic production was either shifted to the areas that were still dry or through fishing. This shows a raised effort at using agriculture on the water, trying to mitigate the changes and try to adapt to them. Similar to, as I mentioned, my time in New Orleans, going to the Ninth Ward, as this is where this photo is the lower Ninth Ward that was flooded when the levee broke in 2005. Brad Pitt helped rebuild parts of the lower Ninth Ward, creating a nonprofit. A lot of other people did as well. Different approaches at trying to mitigate the effects of climate change and the likelihood of flooding going forward. Some people decided to move up their houses a little bit, like you see the house on the left. Others, like the Brad Pitt house, both didn't really match into the old neighborhood with the architectural style, but they were more proactive in trying to raise the house a lot higher to deal with the long-term potential effects and of rising waters. So you see different ways of trying to adapt to it. And so, I mean, that is with water. In Canberra, where I am now, I think water is not necessarily as much of a threat here as it is to New South Wales and Queensland right now. Fires, the last time I taught this class, it was in the context of recovering from the summer fire season. This is a satellite picture from New Year's Day in 2020, and you see the fires in Victoria, ACT, and New South Wales in red below, and it shows the extent to which these kind of disasters, and you overlap this with the population graphs that I showed several weeks ago, or actually it was last week, was the population week. You see that a lot of these fires were in areas that were relatively populated, which can put substantial pressure for short-term displacement and potentially for longer-term displacement. You can look at these kind of maps from a global perspective. This is just within the last 24 hours of me recording this video. You see fires, some of which are man-made, other which are just wildfires around the world. And so with satellite detection systems and NASA, these ones are generated by NASA, you can go look them up and look at your particular parts of the world that you're interested in. You can see the types of fires are easier to measure and to look at where they overlap with population centers. Flooding is also one in which there are a lot of developed means at trying to allow people to mitigate or to adapt to these kind of changing situations. You could look at how the fire season, you can spend a lot of time looking at these kind of maps and looking at how the fire season raises and lowers according to the seasons around the world, and how over the last 20 or 30 years these fires have become more common. So given that, what can people do? The third option, besides doing nothing or trying to mitigate the effects of the change, is to leave. And that is at the heart of today's discussion, right? Through migration, like with Zodiac's here, in trying to get across the Mediterranean, or through the various routes. The IOM have mapped a number of these routes of migrants going through Western Africa, Eastern Africa, and the Middle East. And you, as I showed you the death statistics in an earlier video, these are quite hazardous journeys to try to get to developed states. And there's a lot of information out there about where you can provide for these people and where the deaths actually occur. And so in how people respond to those environmental challenges is something we're going to be looking at in subsequent weeks as well. The important things to take away from this section is the fact that the environment is changing in ways that we've already talked about over the last couple weeks, and we'll be talking about in the subsequent weeks. And what people can do is try to stay and make the best of it and adapt to the situation, or they can leave. And those leaving decisions are going to have an effect on political stability and conflict, which we're going to look at in a subsequent section. And so let's kind of take that Hirschman kind of approach in our discussion to environmental refugees and add that to the frame of the general literature like we read for this week for why people migrate. So let's go ahead and turn to that now.